The letter arrived at midnight, and it changed everything before the sun rose again. Alexander Whitmore stood in the cold study of Ashworth Hall, his hands shaking as he read the words over and over, hoping they would somehow change if he looked at them long enough. They did not change. The bank would seize the estate within 30 days unless the debt was paid in full. 30 days. That was all the time he had left to save 300 years of family history from disappearing forever. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat by the fire with the letter crumpled in his fist, thinking about the woman sleeping in the small cottage at the edge of the estate, a woman who had no idea that his world was about to collapse around them both. Eleanor Marsh did not know about the debt. She did not know that the man she loved was about to be forced into a decision that would break both their hearts. She only knew that she loved him, quietly and completely, the way a person loves someone they were never supposed to have. By morning, Alexander had made his choice, though it felt more like his choice had been made for him. His mother, Charlotte Whitmore, arrived at breakfast already dressed for the day, already composed, already speaking as though the matter were settled before he had said a word. "There is only one way out of this," she said, pouring tea with a steadiness that unsettled him. "Charles Sinclair has a daughter. She is of age, she is unmarried, and her father is one of the wealthiest shipping merchants in the country. A marriage between our families would solve everything." Alexander set down his cup harder than he meant to. "I do not know her." "You do not need to know her," his mother said. "You need to marry her." He wanted to argue, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. There was no other way. The tenants who depended on the estate, the servants who had worked for his family for generations, the history carved into every stone of Ashworth Hall, all of it would vanish if he did not act. He was not simply choosing for himself anymore. He was choosing for everyone who depended on him. Still, his mind kept returning to Eleanor. He pictured her in the small schoolroom where she taught the tenant children their letters and numbers, her voice patient, her laughter easy, her eyes finding his across the room whenever their paths crossed. She had come to Ashworth Hall 2 years earlier, sent by a family friend to serve as governess for his late sister's children before they were sent away to relatives. She had stayed longer than expected, and somewhere in those months, Alexander had fallen in love with her without ever meaning to. He knew what people would say if they found out. A duke did not fall in love with a governess. It was not done. It was not allowed. And yet it had happened anyway, quietly, in stolen moments during long walks through the gardens and late evenings spent talking by candlelight long after everyone else had gone to bed. That afternoon, he found her exactly where he expected, sitting beneath the old oak tree near the eastern fields, a book open on her lap though she was not reading it. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her smile faded the moment she saw his face. "Something is wrong," she said, standing quickly. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to explain the letter, the debt, his mother's plan, the impossible weight pressing down on his shoulders. But when he opened his mouth, the words that came out were not the ones he intended. "I am to be married," he said. Eleanor went very still. "Married," she repeated, as though testing whether the word was real. "To Isabella Sinclair. It has already been arranged." For a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Do you love her?" "No," he admitted. "But it does not matter. This marriage will save the estate. It will save everyone who depends on me." "And what about what I depend on?" Her voice cracked slightly, though she fought to keep it steady. "What about us?" He had no answer that would not sound cruel, so he said nothing, and his silence was answer enough. Eleanor closed her book, held it against her chest like a shield, and walked away from him without another word. He let her go, though every part of him screamed to follow her, to explain, to fix what he had just broken. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself she would understand eventually. He told himself many things that night, and none of them made him feel any better. 2 days later, Charles Sinclair and his daughter arrived at Ashworth Hall for the first time. Isabella Sinclair stepped out of the carriage wearing a traveling dress of deep blue silk, her dark hair pinned elegantly beneath a small hat, her expression polite but guarded. She was, Alexander noticed immediately, nothing like what he expected. She did not carry herself with the careless confidence of someone who had never wanted for anything. Instead, there was something careful in the way she studied her surroundings, something that suggested she understood exactly what this meeting was and exactly what was expected of her. "Your Grace," she said, offering a small curtsy. "Miss Sinclair," he bowed in return, feeling strangely formal, strangely distant from his own body. "Welcome to Ashworth Hall." Their fathers, or in his case, his mother, since his father had passed years earlier, retreated to the drawing room to discuss the terms of the arrangement, leaving Alexander and Isabella alone in the garden under the watchful eye of a chaperone standing a polite distance away. "I understand this was not your idea," Isabella said once they were walking along the gravel path. "The marriage, I mean." Alexander glanced at her, surprised by her directness. "Nor was it yours, I imagine." "No," she agreed. "My father believes a title will secure our family's place among the old aristocracy. Money can buy many things, but it cannot buy the respect that comes with a name like Whitmore." She said this without bitterness, simply stating a fact she had clearly accepted long ago. "I am not foolish enough to believe this will be a love match, but I do hope it might become something more than a business arrangement in time." Her honesty caught him off guard. He had expected either cold indifference or false enthusiasm, not this quiet, practical hope. "You are more sensible than I expected," he said. "And you are more troubled than I expected," she replied, studying his face. "Is there someone else?" The question struck him like a blow, though her tone remained gentle, without judgment. He thought of Alina's face when she walked away from him, the book clutched against her chest, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. He thought of 2 years of stolen moments that would now have to remain buried forever. "There was," he said carefully. "It does not matter now." Isabella studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, though she said nothing more on the subject. They continued walking in silence, both of them carrying the weight of a future neither had chosen but both had agreed to accept. That evening, after the Sinclairs departed, Alexander walked to the cottage at the edge of the estate, hoping to find Alina, hoping to say something that might ease the pain he had caused her. But the cottage was dark, the windows empty, and when he knocked, no one answered. A neighbor, an elderly woman named Margaret who tended the estate's kitchen garden, appeared in her doorway and told him what he did not want to hear. "She left this morning, Your Grace," Margaret said, her eyes carrying a mixture of sympathy and quiet disapproval. "Packed her things and took the early coach. Said she had accepted a position in another town. Didn't say where." Alexander stood frozen in the darkness, the cold air biting at his skin, though he barely felt it. Alina was gone. She had not waited for an explanation, had not given him the chance to make things right, because there had been nothing right left to make. He had chosen duty over love, and now the woman he loved had vanished from his life entirely, taking with her all the warmth and honesty that had made the last 2 years bearable. He returned to Ashworth Hall that night feeling as though he had lost something he would never get back, though he told himself, again and again, that this was simply the price of duty. He told himself he would forget her in time. He told himself the marriage to Isabella Sinclair would fill the emptiness Alina left behind. He did not yet know how wrong he was. He did not yet know that Alina Marsh had left Ashworth Hall carrying a secret far greater than her heartbreak, a secret that would not surface until years later, when it was almost too late to matter. For now, he knew only that the wedding was set, the contracts were being drawn. And in 3 weeks, he would stand before a church full of strangers and marry a woman he did not love, while the woman he did love disappeared into a world that no longer included him. The night before the wedding, Alexander stood at his window overlooking the gardens where he and Alina had spent so many quiet evenings together. The oak tree stood in the distance, its branches bare against the darkening sky, a silent witness to everything that had been lost. He pressed his palm against the cold glass and allowed himself one final moment of grief before closing the curtains and turning away, preparing to become the husband his family needed him to be, even as his heart remained somewhere else entirely, following a woman who was already miles away and getting farther with every passing hour. Tomorrow he would marry Isabella Sinclair. Tomorrow his fate would be sealed. And somewhere out there, unknown to him, Eleanor Marsh carried within her a piece of him that would one day return to change everything. The wedding day arrived with a gray sky, the kind that could not decide whether to rain or clear, much like Alexander's own uncertain heart. Guests filled the ancient stone church of Ashworth Village, whispering among themselves about the sudden union between the struggling duke and the wealthy merchant's daughter. Nobody outside the immediate families knew the true reason behind the hurried arrangement, though everyone had their theories, and most of them were closer to the truth than Alexander would have liked. Isabella walked down the aisle in a gown of pale ivory, her father beaming with pride beside her, clearly satisfied that his ambitions were finally being realized. She looked composed, graceful, every inch the perfect bride, though Alexander caught the faint tremor in her hands as she reached the altar and took her place beside him. "Are you ready?" he whispered, more out of courtesy than genuine curiosity. "As ready as I will ever be," she whispered back, a small, wry smile touching her lips. "Are you?" He did not answer, because the truth was too complicated for a single word, and the ceremony was already beginning. The vicar spoke words that felt distant and unreal, and Alexander repeated his vows mechanically, his mind drifting despite his best efforts to stay present. When he slipped the ring onto Isabella's finger, he caught her eyes and saw something there that surprised him. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a quiet, guarded hope, the same hope she had spoken of in the garden days earlier. Perhaps, he thought, this could become something real after all. Perhaps duty and affection were not always opposites. Perhaps, in time, he could build a life with this woman who had shown him nothing but honesty and patience since the moment they met. But even as the church bells rang out to announce the new Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, and even as the guests applauded and rose to their feet, Alexander felt Eleanor's absence like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He smiled for the crowd. He kissed his new wife when tradition required it. He played the part expected of him with practiced grace. Yet somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice reminded him that the woman standing beside him at the altar, however kind, however deserving of happiness, was not the woman his heart had chosen. And as the carriage carried them away from the church toward the beginning of their new life together, Alexander could not shake the feeling that he had just closed a door on something far more important than he yet understood, a door that fate itself was already planning to open again, in ways he could never have predicted. 6 months into the marriage, Ashworth Hall had settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Isabella managed the household with quiet efficiency, winning over the staff with her fairness and her willingness to learn the traditions of a world she had married into but had not been raised in. She rose early, walked the grounds, reviewed accounts with the estate steward, William Doyle, and slowly, carefully, began to make Ashworth Hall feel like her home too. Alexander watched her do all of this with a growing respect that surprised him, though respect was not the same thing as love, and he knew the difference all too well. Their evenings together were polite and pleasant, filled with conversation about estate matters, local news, and the occasional shared laugh over something one of the servants had said. From the outside, anyone would have believed theirs was a contented marriage, perhaps even a happy one. But at night, when the candles were extinguished and the house grew silent, Alexander often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind wandering to a small cottage that now stood empty at the edge of the estate, and to the woman who had once filled his evenings with warmth he had never quite managed to replace. He told himself again and again that this was simply how life worked for men in his position. Love was a luxury. Duty was the currency that mattered. And yet, no matter how many times he repeated this to himself, the ache in his chest never fully disappeared. Isabella noticed his distance, of course. She was not a foolish woman, and she paid close attention to the small details others might have missed. The way his smile sometimes faded a moment too soon, the way he occasionally answered a question that had not been asked, clearly lost somewhere in thought. She never confronted him directly about it, choosing instead to give him space, hoping that whatever weighed on him would ease with time. She had entered this marriage with clear eyes, understanding it was not born from love, but she had also allowed herself to hope that affection might grow between them naturally, the way it sometimes did for couples who began as strangers. One evening, as autumn settled over the estate and the leaves began turning gold and amber across the grounds, Isabella found Alexander standing alone near the old oak tree, staring off into the distance with an expression she had come to recognize as sorrow, though he always tried to hide it from her. "You come here often," she said, approaching quietly, "more often than any other part of the estate." Alexander turned, startled from his thoughts. "It is a quiet spot," he said, "good for thinking." "Or good for remembering," Isabella replied gently, her eyes steady on his face. "I am not blind, Alexander. Something troubles you, and it has troubled you since before our wedding. I have not asked because I did not think it was my place, but I find myself wondering if it ever will be." He hesitated, torn between honesty and self-protection, between the desire to unburden himself and the fear of what honesty might cost him. In the end, he chose a partial truth, unwilling to reveal everything but no longer able to pretend nothing was wrong. "There was someone before you," he admitted quietly. "Someone I cared for deeply. Circumstances did not allow it to continue." Isabella absorbed this without visible surprise, as though she had already suspected as much. "Do you still think of her?" "More than I should," he confessed, the words escaping before he could stop them. He immediately regretted the honesty, watching her face carefully for signs of hurt or anger. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than wounded. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I would rather know the truth, even a difficult one, than live inside a comfortable lie." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I do not ask you to forget her, Alexander. I only ask that you try to build something real with me in whatever way you are able. We may not have chosen each other out of love, but we can still choose every day to be kind to one another, to be honest, to build a partnership worth having. That is not nothing." Her maturity humbled him. He had expected accusations, perhaps even tears, but instead she offered him grace he felt he did not deserve. From that evening forward, something between them shifted slightly, growing a bit warmer, a bit more genuine. He made a conscious effort to be more present, more engaged, more attentive to the woman who had shown him nothing but patience since their wedding day. Isabella, in turn, allowed herself to relax further into their life together, no longer bracing herself for rejection at every turn. Winter arrived, bringing with it heavy snow and long, quiet evenings by the fire. Alexander and Isabella grew closer during this season, sharing books, playing chess, discussing plans for the estate's future. There were moments, brief but genuine, when Alexander caught himself laughing freely, forgetting for a while the weight he carried. He began to believe, cautiously, that perhaps happiness was still possible, even if it looked different than he once imagined. But fate, it seemed, was not finished testing him. In early spring, nearly 8 months after the wedding, Alexander was going through old correspondence in his study, sorting through papers left untouched since before his marriage, when he discovered a small bundle of letters tucked beneath a stack of estate documents. His hand stilled the moment he recognized the handwriting on the topmost envelope. It was Eleanor's. His heart pounded as he lifted the letter, noting the date scrawled in the corner, written the very morning she had left Ashworth Hall, the morning after he told her about his engagement to Isabella. He had never seen this letter before. Somehow, in the chaos of that final day, it had been misplaced, buried beneath documents and forgotten, waiting nearly a year to be found. His hands trembled as he broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. Eleanor's familiar handwriting filled the paper, and as he read, the world around him seemed to fall away entirely. She wrote of her heartbreak, yes, but she also wrote of something else, something that made his blood run cold and his breath catch painfully in his throat. She wrote that she believed herself to be carrying his child, that she had suspected it for several weeks before that final conversation beneath the oak tree, and that she had intended to tell him in person, but his announcement of the engagement had stolen the words from her before she could speak them. She wrote that she did not expect anything from him, that she understood the impossible position he was in, but that she wanted him to know the truth before she disappeared from his life entirely. She wrote that she would raise the child alone, that she had already secured a teaching position in a town called Bramwell, several counties away, and that she hoped, someday, he might forgive himself for choices neither of them had truly been free to make. Alexander read the letter 3 times before he could fully absorb its meaning. A child. His child, possibly nearly a year old by now, growing up somewhere without him, raised by a mother he had abandoned without ever knowing the full truth of what she carried. The weight of this realization crushed him entirely. He sat frozen at his desk for what felt like hours, the letter clutched in his hands, his mind racing through 1,000 possibilities and 1,000 regrets. He thought of confronting his mother, of demanding to know if she had ever suspected any of this, but he quickly abandoned the idea, knowing it would change nothing and only complicate matters further. He thought of writing immediately for Bramwell, of finding Eleanor and the child and demanding answers, but he forced himself to slow down, to think clearly rather than act on pure emotion, aware that any misstep now could cause even greater harm. More than anything, he thought of Isabella, asleep upstairs, unaware that her husband's entire understanding of his own life had just shattered into pieces. How could he tell her this? How could he explain that the woman from his past had not simply disappeared broken-hearted, but had vanished carrying a piece of him that neither of them yet fully understood? He did not sleep that night, nor the night after. He carried the letter with him constantly, reading it over and over until the words were memorized, until he could recite every line without looking. He began making quiet inquiries, careful not to draw attention, asking trusted contacts if anyone had heard of a woman named Eleanor Marsh settling in or around the town of Bramwell. Weeks passed with no solid answers, only fragments of information that led nowhere definite. Isabella noticed the change in him almost immediately, the return of the distance she had worked so hard to close, the distracted look that had returned to his eyes, deeper and more troubled than before. She tried, gently, to ask what had changed, but Alexander deflected her questions, unable to find the courage to reveal what he had discovered, terrified of what it might mean for the fragile trust they had built together over the winter months. The tension between them grew slowly but steadily, an invisible wall rising between two people who had only just begun to understand one another. Isabella began to suspect, though she could not prove it, that whatever had reopened this wound in her husband was connected to the woman he had once loved, the woman whose name he had never spoken aloud, the woman whose presence seemed to haunt every quiet corner of Ashworth Hall despite having been gone for nearly a year. By early summer, Alexander finally received a piece of information that changed everything. A former acquaintance, a merchant who traveled frequently between counties for business, mentioned in passing that he recalled meeting a young schoolteacher in Bramwell the previous autumn, a woman with a small child, quiet and well-liked among the townspeople, though she kept mostly to herself and rarely spoke of her past. The description matched too closely to be coincidence. Alexander felt something inside him ignite, a mixture of hope and dread so powerful it left him breathless. He now had a name of a town, a general description, and a timeline that lined up almost perfectly with Eleanor's letter. He knew with absolute certainty that he needed to go to Bramwell himself, to see the truth with his own eyes, no matter what it might cost him. But leaving Ashworth Hall without explanation was impossible, especially now, with Isabella growing more suspicious by the day, and the estate requiring his constant attention as the summer harvest approached. He would need a reason, a believable excuse that would allow him to travel without revealing the truth before he was certain enough to speak it aloud. He decided, finally, that he would tell Isabella a partial version of events, framing it as urgent estate business requiring his personal attention in a neighboring county. It was not entirely a lie, he told himself, since he did intend to investigate matters that would ultimately affect his family, even if not in the way she would assume. He hated deceiving her, especially after everything she had shown him in terms of honesty and patience, but he could not yet bring himself to reveal a truth so devastating without first confirming it beyond doubt. As he prepared for the journey, packing quietly and quickly, he caught sight of himself in the mirror of his dressing room and barely recognized the man staring back at him. A year ago, he had been a duke preparing to marry for duty, resigned to a life without the woman he loved. Now, he was a husband preparing to chase down the truth of a child he never knew existed, uncertain whether he was about to find redemption or ruin everything he had worked so hard to rebuild. He left Ashworth Hall before dawn the next morning, telling Isabella only that he would return within a fortnight. She watched him go from the window of their bedroom, her arms crossed against the early morning chill, an unreadable expression on her face. She did not yet know the truth, but some instinct deep within her told her that whatever awaited her husband on this journey would change the course of both their lives forever, and she was not entirely certain she was ready for what that change might bring. As his carriage rolled away from the estate and toward the winding road that would eventually lead to Bramwell, Alexander felt his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation he had not experienced since the day he learned his family's fortune was at risk. Only this time, the stakes felt even higher, because this time it was not merely his inheritance on the line, but the chance to finally face the truth he had been running from for nearly a year, and perhaps, if fate allowed it, the chance to see Aliner's face again after all this time, and to meet the child who carried his blood without ever having known his name. The road to Bramwell was longer than Alexander remembered any journey feeling before. Each mile stretched endlessly, the carriage wheels grinding over uneven country roads, the countryside blurring past in shades of green and gold under the summer sun, though Alexander barely noticed any of it. His mind remained fixed entirely on the letter in his coat pocket, now worn soft at the folds from being read so many times, and on the fragile hope that he might finally find the answers he desperately needed. He arrived in Bramwell on the second evening of his journey, the small market town quieter and more modest than Ashworth Village, its narrow streets lined with stone cottages and a single church spire rising above the rooftops. He took a room at the local inn, exhausted from travel but too restless to rest, and began asking careful, discreet questions of the innkeeper, a friendly older man named Edmund Clark, who seemed to know everyone within a 10-mile radius. "A school teacher, you say?" Edmund said, wiping down the counter as he considered the question. "There's a young woman teaches the children over at the parish school. Been here a year or so now if memory serves. Keeps mostly to herself, but she's well liked. Has a little boy, sweet lad, quiet like his mother." Alexander's heart nearly stopped in his chest. A boy. His hands gripped the edge of the counter as he steadied himself, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the storm raging inside him. "Do you know her name?" "Marsh, I believe," Edmund said. "Aliner Marsh. Lives in the cottage near the schoolhouse just past the old mill." The name confirmed everything, and yet hearing it spoken aloud by a stranger made the reality of the situation crash over him with renewed force. Aliner was here. Their child was here. Everything Alexander had suspected, hoped, and feared for the past several weeks was suddenly, undeniably real. He did not sleep at all that night. He lay awake in the narrow inn room, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing what he might say, how he might explain his sudden appearance after nearly a year of silence, how he might begin to make amends for a wound he was not even certain could be healed. By the time dawn broke over Bramwell, he had rehearsed a dozen different speeches and abandoned every single one of them, realizing that no rehearsed words could possibly prepare him for the moment he was about to face. He walked to the schoolhouse just after sunrise, timing his arrival for when he knew the children would not yet have gathered for lessons, wanting to speak with Alina privately before the day began. The schoolhouse was a small stone building with a single chimney, smoke already curling from it into the cool morning air, suggesting someone inside was awake and preparing for the day ahead. He knocked on the door, his heart hammering so violently he could hear it in his ears. For a long moment there was no answer, and he wondered if perhaps he had the wrong building, or if Alina was not yet inside. Then he heard footsteps approaching, and the door opened, and there she was. Alina stood in the doorway, wearing a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back loosely, a look of confusion crossing her face as she registered who stood before her. The confusion quickly shifted into shock, and then into something far more complicated, a mixture of old pain and lingering affection and deep uncertainty about what his sudden appearance might mean. "Alexander," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "I found your letter," he said, the words tumbling out before he could organize them properly. "The one you left before you went away. I only found it a few weeks ago. It had been misplaced among some papers and I never saw it until now. Alina, I am so sorry. I did not know. If I had known, I never would have let you leave the way you did." Alina's eyes filled with tears, though she fought visibly to keep her composure. "You should not have come," she said, though her voice lacked real conviction, as though she herself was uncertain whether she meant the words. "I had to," Alexander said. "I had to see for myself. Is it true? Do we have a child?" Before Alina could answer, a small voice called out from somewhere behind her, inside the cottage attached to the schoolhouse. "Mama, who is at the door?" Alexander's breath caught entirely as a small boy appeared in the doorway beside Alina, peering curiously up at the stranger standing outside. The boy could not have been more than a year old, with dark hair and eyes that, even at such a young age, bore an unmistakable resemblance to Alexander's own reflection in countless mirrors throughout his life. There was no denying it, no possibility of mistake or coincidence. This was his son. "His name is Henry," Alina said quietly, watching Alexander's face carefully as he absorbed the sight before him. "He will be 1 year old next month." Alexander knelt down slowly, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, though he remained a respectful distance away, unsure of his welcome, unsure of anything at all in this overwhelming moment. Henry studied him with the open curiosity of a child, unafraid but cautious, tilting his head slightly as though trying to place why this stranger felt somehow familiar. "Hello, Henry," Alexander said softly, his voice thick with emotion he could barely contain. Alina gently guided her son back inside, asking him to wait for her in the kitchen, before stepping outside herself and closing the door partially behind her, creating a small private space for the conversation that needed to happen between the two adults. "I did not come here to disrupt your life," Alexander said quickly before she could speak. "I understand I have no right to simply appear after all this time, but I needed you to know that I did not abandon you both intentionally. I never knew. If I had known, everything would have been different." "Would it have been?" Alina asked, her voice sharper now, years of hurt finally finding an outlet. "You were already engaged to marry someone else, Alexander. Even if you had known about Henry, what exactly would you have done? Broken the engagement? Risked your entire family's future for a governess and a child born outside of marriage? We both know that was never truly possible." Her words struck him hard, because he could not honestly deny them. He had chosen duty once before, and the painful truth was that even with the knowledge of Henry's existence, the impossible circumstances surrounding his engagement to Isabella would likely have remained unchanged. The realization sat bitterly in his chest, a reminder that some mistakes could not simply be undone by good intentions arriving too late. "I do not know what I would have done," he admitted honestly. "But I know what I want to do now. I want to be part of Henry's life. I want to help provide for him, to know him, to be his father in whatever way you will allow me to be." Alina studied him for a long moment, her expression guarded, clearly weighing years of accumulated hurt against the sincerity she saw in his eyes. "You are married, Alexander. You have a wife waiting for you at Ashworth Hall. What exactly do you imagine happens now? Do you intend to introduce Henry to your family, to society? Do you understand what that would mean for him, for the scandal it would create, for the way people would treat him for the rest of his life?" Every question she raised was fair, and every answer he might offer felt inadequate against the weight of the reality she described. He had not thought this far ahead, consumed entirely by the need to simply find her, to see the truth with his own eyes, without fully considering the impossible complications that truth would create once confirmed. "I need time to think," he admitted, "but I am not willing to walk away again, Alina. Not now that I know the truth. Whatever this means, whatever it costs me, I intend to find a way to be present in my son's life." Alina's eyes softened slightly, though the guardedness remained. "I do not want anything from you, Alexander. I have built a life here, a good one, even if it is simple. Henry is happy. I am able to provide for him through my work. I did not come to Bramwell hoping you would find us someday. I came here to start over, away from everything that reminded me of what I lost." "I understand," Alexander said quietly. "But surely Henry deserves the chance to know his father, if that is something you would allow, even in a limited way." They talked for nearly an hour that morning, standing outside the small schoolhouse as the sun climbed higher into the sky, working through years of unspoken pain and uncertainty about what the future might hold. Alina remained cautious, unwilling to fully trust the sudden reappearance of a man who had once chosen his family's expectations over their love, but she also could not deny the sincerity in his voice, nor the genuine warmth with which he had looked at Henry. By the time Alexander finally departed Bramwell to return to Ashworth Hall, no permanent decisions had been made, but a fragile agreement had been reached. He would return periodically to see Henry, quietly and discreetly, and he would provide financial support to ensure both Alina and their son wanted for nothing. Beyond that, the future remained uncertain, clouded by the complicated reality of his marriage, his position, and the impossible expectations of the world he had been born into. The journey back to Ashworth Hall felt entirely different from the journey that had brought him to Bramwell. Where before he had traveled with desperate hope and uncertainty, now he traveled with the heavy knowledge of a truth he could no longer avoid, and the growing awareness that his carefully constructed life was about to become far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Isabella was waiting for him when he returned, standing in the entrance hall of Ashworth Hall with an expression that immediately told him she suspected something significant had happened during his absence. She had spent the past 2 weeks quietly investigating on her own, unable to ignore the strange urgency with which he had departed, and unwilling to simply wait passively for explanations that might never come. "You look different," she observed carefully, studying his face as he removed his traveling coat. "Tell me the truth, Alexander. What happened in Bramwell?" He knew, standing there in the entrance hall of the home they now shared, that the moment of honesty he had been avoiding could no longer be postponed. Isabella deserved the truth, however difficult it might be for both of them to face, and he understood that the choices he made in the coming moments would determine the entire course of the rest of their lives together, whatever that future might ultimately look like. "I need to speak with you privately," he said quietly. "There is something you deserve to know, and I am afraid it will change everything between us." Isabella's face paled slightly, though she nodded, leading him toward the drawing room with the composed dignity that had defined her since the day they first met. As the door closed behind them, sealing them both into the quiet privacy of the room, Alexander understood that he was about to test the fragile trust they had spent nearly a year building together, uncertain whether it would survive the truth he was finally ready to share. Alexander told Isabella everything. He told her about Alina, about the 2 years of quiet affection that had grown between them before his engagement was arranged. He told her about the letter he had discovered, hidden away for nearly a year, and the devastating truth it revealed. He told her about his journey to Bramwell, about the small boy with dark hair and familiar eyes who had opened the cottage door and looked up at him with innocent curiosity, unaware that the stranger standing before him was his own father. Isabella listened without interrupting, her expression shifting through several emotions as the story unfolded: shock, hurt, disbelief, and finally, a kind of weary understanding that seemed to settle over her like a heavy blanket. When Alexander finally finished speaking, silence filled the drawing room, thick and uncomfortable, neither of them quite certain how to proceed. "A son," Isabella finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "You have a son." "Yes," Alexander confirmed. "And you intend to remain part of his life." "I do. I cannot walk away from him now that I know the truth. I understand if this changes things between us, Isabella. I understand if you cannot forgive this." Isabella rose from her chair and walked slowly toward the window, staring out at the gardens beyond, her back turned to him as she processed everything he had just revealed. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a complicated mixture of hurt and resolve. "I married you knowing you did not love me, Alexander. I accepted that from the beginning, hoping that affection might grow between us over time, and in many ways it has. I have come to care for you, perhaps more than I intended to. But this changes the foundation of everything I believed our marriage was becoming." "I know," he said quietly. "I am sorry for the pain this causes you. You deserve better than the position I have placed you in. Do not apologize to me as though I am simply a victim in this situation," Isabella said, turning to face him, her eyes flashing with sudden intensity. "I am your wife. I have a right to be angry, yes, but I also have a right to decide what happens next, and I do not intend to simply disappear quietly while you sort out your feelings for another woman and her child." Her strength, even in the midst of clear pain, reminded him once again why he had come to respect her so deeply over the past year, even without the presence of romantic love between them. "What do you want, Isabella? Tell me, and I will listen." She considered the question carefully before answering, her composure returning gradually as she thought through the impossible situation before her. "I want honesty going forward. No more secrets, no more disappearing without explanation. If you intend to be part of your son's life, I need to understand what that means for our marriage, for our household, and for whatever future we build together, if any future remains possible at all." "I do not know all the answers yet," Alexander admitted, "but I promise you honesty from this point forward. Whatever decisions I make, I will make them with you, not around you." Isabella studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then we will figure this out together, difficult as it may be. But understand this, Alexander, I will not spend the rest of my life pretending this does not affect me, nor will I simply step aside without a voice in decisions that impact both our lives and this household." Over the following weeks, an uneasy but honest new arrangement began to take shape between them. Alexander made no attempt to hide his continued correspondence with Alina, nor his periodic visits to Bramwell to see Henry, though he was careful and discreet, aware of how devastating a public scandal could be for everyone involved, including Isabella, whose reputation would suffer greatly if the truth became widely known. Isabella, for her part, struggled visibly with the arrangement, though she made genuine efforts to remain fair and reasonable, understanding that Henry, an innocent child, deserved no punishment for circumstances entirely outside his control. There were difficult evenings, tense conversations, and moments where old wounds resurfaced painfully between them, but there were also moments of surprising grace, where Isabella's inherent fairness and patience shone through despite her own private hurt. Word eventually began to spread, as it always does in small communities, despite Alexander's careful discretion. A servant overheard a conversation not meant for other ears. A traveling merchant mentioned seeing the Duke of Ashworth in Bramwell on more than one occasion. Whispers began circulating among the local aristocracy. Questions raised at social gatherings that Isabella was forced to navigate with practiced grace, deflecting curiosity while privately wrestling with her own uncertain feelings about the entire situation. Charlotte Whitmore, Alexander's mother, learned the truth during a visit to Ashworth Hall in early autumn, and her reaction was swift and severe. She confronted her son privately, horrified by the potential scandal, demanding he cease all contact with Eleanor and the child immediately, insisting that any acknowledgement of an illegitimate son could destroy the family's remaining reputation entirely. "I will not abandon my son a second time," Alexander told his mother firmly, standing his ground despite her fury. "I made that mistake once already, and I will not repeat it simply to protect appearances." Charlotte left Ashworth Hall angrier than he had ever seen her, though her anger did little to shake his resolve. If anything, the confrontation strengthened his determination to remain present in Henry's life, whatever the social cost might ultimately prove to be. Meanwhile, in Bramwell, Eleanor watched the situation unfold from a cautious distance, aware that her presence in Alexander's life was creating significant turmoil within his marriage and his family, though she made no demands of him beyond ensuring Henry's well-being and happiness. She remained fiercely protective of her son, unwilling to allow him to become a pawn in the complicated politics of aristocratic reputation and duty. During one of Alexander's visits that autumn, Eleanor finally voiced a concern that had been weighing on her for weeks. "Alexander, I need to know your intentions clearly. Are you simply trying to ease your own guilt through occasional visits, or do you genuinely intend to be a consistent presence in Henry's life, regardless of the difficulty it creates for you?" "I intend to be present," he said firmly. "Whatever it costs me personally, Henry deserves a father who shows up, not one who disappears when circumstances become inconvenient." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching his face for any hint of insincerity, finding none. "And what of your wife? What of Isabella? This situation cannot be sustainable indefinitely, not without significant consequences for everyone involved, including Henry himself as he grows older and begins to understand more of his circumstances." Alexander did not have easy answers to her questions, though he recognized the truth in them. The current arrangement, built on careful discretion and fragile agreements, could not continue indefinitely, without eventually forcing him toward decisions he had been avoiding since discovering Eleanor's letter months earlier. As winter approached once again, nearly 1 full year since Alexander had first discovered the truth about Henry's existence, the pressure surrounding the situation intensified from every direction. Charlotte continued pressing him to sever ties with Eleanor entirely, warning of irreparable damage to the family name. Isabella, though remaining outwardly composed, grew increasingly weary of navigating a marriage complicated by circumstances she had never anticipated when she agreed to the arrangement. And Eleanor, watching Henry grow older with each passing month, began quietly questioning whether the current situation truly served her son's best interests, or whether it simply prolonged an impossible arrangement that satisfied no one fully. Everything came to a head on a cold evening in early winter, when Isabella, exhausted from months of carefully maintained composure, finally confronted Alexander directly in the privacy of their bedroom, her patience finally reaching its limit. "I cannot continue like this indefinitely, Alexander," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "I have tried to be understanding, to give you space to navigate this impossible situation, but I am your wife, and I deserve clarity about our future together. Do you intend to remain married to me, truly committed to building a life together, Or is your heart entirely elsewhere, with a woman and child you cannot fully claim without destroying everything we have built? Alexander sat heavily on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands, the weight of the impossible choice before him finally crystallizing into something he could no longer avoid confronting directly. "I do not know how to answer that honestly without hurting you," he admitted quietly. "Then answer honestly anyway," Isabella said, her voice firm despite the vulnerability beneath it. "I would rather face painful truth than continue living inside uncertain silence." The room fell into heavy quiet as Alexander searched within himself for an answer he had been avoiding for months, aware that whatever he said next would fundamentally alter the course of both their lives, and likely Eleanor's and Henry's as well. The impossible tangle of duty, love, guilt, and genuine affection that had defined the past year of his life demanded resolution, and he understood, sitting there in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, that he could no longer postpone the reckoning that awaited him. "I need to see them again," he finally said. "I need to speak with Eleanor honestly about what comes next, and then I need to speak with you honestly about what I discover. I owe you both clarity, Isabella, and I intend to find it, however difficult that process may prove to be." Isabella nodded slowly, tears finally slipping down her cheeks despite her efforts to remain composed. "Then go, Alexander. Find your answers. But understand that whatever you decide, I will not wait indefinitely in uncertain limbo. I have my own life to consider, my own happiness to protect, regardless of how this marriage ultimately concludes." Her words carried both understanding and warning in equal measure, and Alexander recognized, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, that the choices ahead of him would require real sacrifice, whatever direction he ultimately chose. There would be no path forward that avoided pain entirely, no solution that satisfied everyone involved without cost. He had spent the past year trying to hold together an impossible arrangement through careful discretion and divided attention, and now, finally, the time had come to make a genuine choice, one that would define not only his own future, but the futures of everyone connected to him through love, duty, and blood. He departed for Bramwell once again the following morning, this time with a clarity of purpose he had lacked during previous visits. He was no longer simply seeking to confirm a painful truth or maintain a fragile arrangement through careful management. This time, he traveled toward Bramwell seeking a genuine answer to the question that had haunted him since the moment he learned of Henry's existence. Where did his heart truly belong? And what sacrifices was he finally willing to make to honor that answer honestly, regardless of the cost to his title, his family's expectations, or the comfortable arrangement he had built with Isabella over the past difficult year? Snow had begun falling over Bramwell by the time Alexander's carriage arrived, dusting the rooftops and narrow streets in soft white, giving the small town an unusually quiet, peaceful appearance despite the storm of emotion churning inside him. He walked directly to the cottage near the schoolhouse, his boots crunching against the freshly fallen snow, his heart pounding with the same intensity it had carried during his very first visit nearly 6 months earlier. Eleanor opened the door before he could knock, as though some instinct had told her he was coming. She studied his face for a long moment, reading something there that made her expression shift from surprise into cautious understanding. "Come inside," she said quietly. "Henry is napping. We can talk without interruption." The cottage was small but warm, filled with simple, well-cared-for furniture and the unmistakable evidence of a loving home. Children's drawings pinned to the walls, a well-worn rocking chair near the fireplace, books stacked neatly on modest shelves. Alexander sat across from Eleanor at a small wooden table, acutely aware of how different this quiet, humble space felt from the grand halls of Ashworth, and yet how much more genuine warmth it seemed to hold. "I need to ask you something important," Alexander began, his voice steady despite the nervousness churning beneath the surface. "And I need you to answer honestly, regardless of what you think I want to hear." Eleanor nodded, folding her hands on the table before her. Ask, do you still love me, Alina? After everything, after all the pain I caused you, after the year of silence before I finally learned the truth, do you still carry any love for me at all, or has too much been broken for that to remain possible? Alina's eyes filled with tears immediately, and for a long moment she said nothing, clearly wrestling with an answer she had perhaps been avoiding even within her own private thoughts. I have spent over a year trying to convince myself that I no longer loved you, she finally admitted, her voice trembling. I told myself that a man who chooses duty over love does not deserve to be loved in return. I built an entire life here in Bramwell specifically to escape those feelings, to protect myself and Henry from the pain of loving someone who ultimately chose someone else. And did it work? Alexander asked gently. No, Alina whispered, a single tear escaping down her cheek. It never worked. I love you still, Alexander, despite every reasonable argument I have made against it. But loving you does not erase the reality of our circumstances. You are married. You have responsibilities to Isabella, to your family, to your title. Love alone cannot simply undo all of that. Alexander reached across the table and gently took her hand, the first time he had touched her in over a year, and the contact sent a wave of emotion through both of them that neither could fully hide. I have spent the past year trying to convince myself that duty and love could somehow coexist peacefully, that I could maintain my marriage while remaining present in Henry's life, that everyone involved could find enough happiness within an imperfect arrangement. But I no longer believe that is possible, Alina. Isabella deserves a husband who is fully present, fully committed, not one whose heart remains divided indefinitely. And Henry deserves a father who is not simply a periodic visitor in his life, hidden away out of fear of scandal. What are you saying? Alina asked, though something in her eyes suggested she already understood, or at least hoped she understood correctly. I am saying that I cannot continue living a divided life, Alexander said firmly. I love you, Alina. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day since you left Ashworth Hall. I made the wrong choice a year ago, choosing duty over love because I believed I had no other option. But I have come to understand that some choices, however difficult, however costly, must ultimately be made with the heart, not merely with practical calculation. Alina's breath caught, hope and fear warring visibly across her expression. Alexander, think carefully about what you are suggesting. If you leave your marriage, if you choose openly to acknowledge Henry and build a life with us, you risk everything, your title, your family's standing, the estate you worked so hard to save. Society will not simply accept this quietly. There will be scandal, consequences that follow you and Henry for the rest of your lives. I understand the risks, Alexander said. I have thought of little else during the journey here, but I have also come to understand something else. Something that took me far too long to accept, an inheritance without love, a title without genuine happiness, an entire life built purely around duty and appearance, is not truly a life worth protecting at such tremendous personal cost. I would rather risk everything for a chance at real happiness, real love, and a genuine relationship with my son, than continue living a comfortable lie that satisfies society's expectations, while leaving everyone involved quietly miserable. Tears streamed freely down Alina's face now, though a small, hopeful smile had begun to form despite them. And Isabella, what happens to her in all of this? Isabella deserves honesty and the freedom to build her own genuine happiness, whatever form that takes, Alexander said. I spoke with her before I left Ashworth Hall. She understands that clarity is coming, one way or another. She told me, in her own way, that she refuses to remain trapped in uncertain limbo indefinitely. I believe, difficult as this transition will be, that ending our marriage honestly may ultimately allow her to find happiness she deserves, perhaps with someone whose heart is not permanently divided. They talked for hours that afternoon, working through the complicated practicalities that would follow such a monumental decision. The legal complexities of ending his marriage to Isabella, the social consequences that would inevitably follow, the difficult conversations that still needed to happen with his mother, with Isabella's family, with the broader community that would undoubtedly judge harshly a duke who chose scandal over convention. When Henry woke from his nap and toddled into the room, rubbing sleepy eyes, he paused upon seeing Alexander sitting at the table, studying him with the same curious expression from their first meeting months earlier. This time, however, there was a flicker of recognition in his young eyes, evidence of the periodic visits that had slowly built familiarity between father and son over recent months. "Papa," Henry said softly, the word simple but carrying immense weight for everyone in the room. Alexander felt his heart swell with an emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him entirely. He knelt down and gathered his son into his arms, holding him close, finally allowing himself to fully embrace the role he had spent months carefully approaching from a cautious distance. "Yes, Henry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Papa is here." Elinor watched the reunion with tears streaming freely down her face, finally allowing herself to believe that perhaps, after everything, a genuine future together might truly be possible. The following weeks proved every bit as difficult as Alexander had anticipated. His return to Ashworth Hall brought the difficult conversation with Isabella that both of them had known was coming. She received the news of his decision with a complicated mixture of pain and something that looked almost like relief, the exhausting uncertainty of the past year finally reaching resolution, however painful that resolution proved to be. "I suspected this was coming," Isabella admitted quietly, sitting across from him in the same drawing room where he had first confessed the truth about Elinor and Henry months earlier. "I cannot pretend it does not hurt, Alexander, but I also cannot pretend that our marriage was ever built on the kind of love that could sustain a lifetime together. I entered this arrangement with clear eyes, hoping for something more, but perhaps it is better for both of us to part now, honestly, rather than continue indefinitely inside a marriage neither of us can fully commit to." "I am sorry, Isabella," Alexander said sincerely. "You deserved better than the position I placed you in from the very beginning." "Perhaps," Isabella said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "But I do not regret the time we spent together, difficult as parts of it were. You showed me honesty and respect, even when the truth was painful to share. I believe in time I will find happiness of my own, perhaps with someone whose heart is not already claimed elsewhere." Their separation proceeded with as much discretion and dignity as such an unprecedented situation allowed, though inevitably, whispers and scandal followed throughout the county, exactly as Alexander had anticipated. Charlotte Whitmore remained furious for months, threatening to disown him entirely, though her anger gradually softened over time as she watched her son build a genuine, happy life with Elinor and Henry, eventually finding herself unable to resist the charm of her young grandson, whose easy laughter and innocent affection slowly wore down even her strongest resistance. Isabella, true to her word, eventually found happiness elsewhere, remarrying within 2 years to a kind, steady man who offered her the wholehearted devotion she had always deserved, and who never asked her to compete with a memory that could never truly be replaced. As for Alexander, Elinor, and Henry, their path forward was not without continued difficulty. Society did not fully forgive the scandal, and certain doors remained permanently closed to them within the highest circles of aristocratic life. But within the walls of Ashworth Hall, now filled once again with genuine laughter and warmth, Alexander finally found the happiness he had sacrificed a year earlier for the sake of duty and appearance. He married Elinor quietly the following spring, in a small ceremony attended only by their closest friends and family, a stark contrast to the grand, public spectacle of his first wedding. As he stood before her, exchanging vows built on genuine love rather than practical necessity, Alexander finally understood the true lesson his difficult journey had taught him, that titles, fortunes, and social standing meant nothing without genuine love to give them purpose, and that the greatest inheritance a man could ever claim was not measured in land or gold, but in the honest, hard-won happiness of building a life with the people he truly loved, regardless of what it cost him to finally choose them. Years later, watching Henry grow alongside younger siblings born from his marriage to Eleanor, Alexander often reflected on how close he had come to losing everything that truly mattered, simply by choosing duty over love in a single, impulsive moment years earlier. It had taken him nearly losing Eleanor forever to understand that some choices, however impossible they seem in the moment, must ultimately be guided by the heart, and that true love, once genuinely found, was always worth fighting for, regardless of the price demanded to keep it.